I'm interested in information gathering and how the ecology of a species affects its behavior, so how habitat or diet affects information gathering. And animals have to make quite a few decisions about the habitats they want to live in, the territories they occupied, with whom you mate, and also where to forage. And there's very little known about how animals assess the environment, even though this is a very important component for decision making. And when I started my research career, I became immediately interested in how far ecological conditions may affect how animals collect environmental information. But I also thought that possibly lifestyle, being resident or migratory, can have an effect on information gathering, and also the social conditions, whether an animal is solitary or lives in a group and can possibly pick up information from others. And how animals assess the environment can have quite far-reaching consequences, because it may affect fitness, finding the right partner, the right habitat. It may influence reproduction, whether the nest site is safe from predation. And at the end, it also affects survival, staying away from predators, for example. So learning about how animals collect information about the environment is quite important, because they obviously have to make decisions where to live and where to forage. And obviously, you can imagine that there are quite a few interactions between these different factors, but I don't want to go into detail here. You may think the best strategy would be to collect as much information as possible, because the more you know, the better you are informed and the better your decision is. But you should consider that there are also costs of information gathering, like the energy or time invested in information gathering, costs of producing neuronal tissue, which stores the information you collect, a higher predation risk because the animal is more exposed to the environment, but may also be less vigilant. And there can also be dangerous encounters, for example, with poisonous food. And I thought that these costs may differ depending on the environment. For example, the habitat may incur different costs. For example, an open habitat may have a higher predation risk because the animal is easier to discover, whereas in a very dense habitat it can hide away. Also, with the food spectrum, animals foraging on dangerous food like poisonous insects, they may have dangerous encounters, so should be more careful. And finally, lifestyle can have effect on the costs, as for example, a migrant moves around and only stays for a couple of months in every area, so they lose quite a bit of information as soon as they move on. On the other hand, there are obviously benefits of information gathering, and you can describe this as a value of information, which is defined as a difference in payoff between a decision of an informed and an uninformed individual. So it's not how much information is collected, but it's more how useful this information is to make a really better decision rather than having more information. And again, I would hypothesize that the value of information differs depending on the environment. In a variable environment, it makes sense to collect information and update the knowledge, whereas in a constant environment, nothing is changing. So why collecting information? There is no increase in value. Similarly, when resources are patchily distributed, it makes sense to look for new resources, for example, a flowering tree that may be fruiting in the future. So when the current resource is exploited, the animal knows where to go later on. Whereas in a continuous environment, where, for example, an animal is foraging mainly on grass seeds that have a huge distribution, and they are basically continuously available, it doesn't really make sense to collect information to find another field with grass seeds, because the current area may have enough energy. So I would say it's not to collect as much environmental information as possible, But animals should adapt the collection of environmental information to the costs and benefits of it. And as I said, that I expect that costs and benefits differ depending on the environment, I would also predict that species differ in their information gathering. So let's first talk about how we can measure information gathering. Luckily, it's quite easy to investigate in captivity because whenever you introduce some novelty, you will get some so-called exploratory behavior, so approach to the novel and then exploration and investigation. So you can, for example, change something in the familiar environment by providing a novel object, then you study object exploration, or you can provide a novel environment and then you study spatial exploration. But novelty does not only elicit approach and exploration, but also elicits avoidance behavior, which is called neophobia. And this neophobia basically protects the animal from danger and basically reducing the costs in approaching something dangerous. Both behaviors, exploratory behavior and neophobia, have a heritable component. So this means they are subject to natural selection. And obviously, the behaviors can be passed on from the parents to the young. So what have I done? It is quite a while ago. Actually, it was my PhD project. So I started to investigate exploration and neophobia in parrots, actually in 61 parrot species from very different groups, cockadoos, lorikeets, broad-tailed parrots, Amazons, whatever you can think of. These species differed in their ecological conditions. So I had species with different habitat complexity in their natural environment, very open and simple habitats like the savanna, a bit more complex habitats with scattered trees, then really complex habitats like the forest edge, where the animals can use different strata and can use the open environment, but also the more dense environment. And finally, the forest itself, which again is a complex habitat. I also distinguished 10 different types of food, like seeds, fruits, blossoms, nectar and pollen, insects, and this kind of stuff. And I also wrote down whether the animals originated from the island or from islands or from the mainland, because there's usually a higher predation pressure on the mainland, so this would increase the costs of exploration. And when you compare so many different species, you have to consider their phylogeny, so their relatedness, because close related species tend to behave more similar than more distantly related species. So I used 2 experiments. I investigated exploration by placing a novel object, this wooden ring, at a neutral location over a perch away from food and water. So the animals were not forced to approach, but we assumed when they approach, this is driven by interest in the novel object and exploration. However, one should keep in mind the approach latency is also influenced by neophobia because it's an interplay between approach and avoidance when they finally decide to approach. However, once they approach, this is more driven by neophilia and curiosity. For neophobia, we placed a novel object like this cotton mob beside the familiar feeding dish. And here you create a conflict between the motivation to feed and the motivation to avoid the novel object. And by measuring the time to feed with and without object, you get a very clear indication how fearful the animal is. Usually there's no exploration elicited because the animal is in this foraging mode. So let's first see the results from the exploration experiment. You see there's a really nice correlation between some of the ecological factors and the time to approach. These contrasts here indicate that I have used phylogenetic corrections in the analysis. What this figure doesn't show is that, for example, species that came from a very complex habitat like the forest edge had very short exploration time. So they basically approached immediately and investigated the novel object. But also species that were foraging on buds and fruits, these are food types that are difficult to find in the wild, had very short times to approach the novel object. And also island species were very explorative, possibly because there is less predation, so the costs are reduced. But also there's often a food shortage, a temporary food shortage on islands because of the size restriction. And this would make it very advantageous to be explorative and find new resources. With respect to neophobia, we found that species that feed on possibly dangerous food like insects showed the strongest neophobia reaction. So they stayed away from the food for the longest time, sometimes 1.5 hours before they resumed feeding. So to summarize the results, we could indeed show that exploration and neophobia differ between species as an adaptation to the ecological conditions. And we also showed that exploration and neophobia are related to different ecological factors. For example, neophobia was more affected by having insects in the diet or possibly dangerous food, whereas exploration was more affected by a very complex habitat and food types that are difficult to find, and also origin from islands. Coming back to this initial model, so I could show that ecological conditions have an effect how animals assess the environment, how easily they are willing to approach a novel object. And I've shown this in quite a few parrot species. Later on in my research life, I also looked into lifestyle, so basically compared resident and migratory species, and did this in different studies in quite a range of different species. And here I could show, for example, that residents are more explorative than migrants or nomads, because residents stay in the same area throughout their life. So they have to react to changes in the environment, which could mean new food resources, which would allow them to stay in the same habitat throughout the year, even when the season changes. I also showed that residents are less neophobic than migrants, again supporting that resources can be easily utilized, so they are less hesitant to approach something new. And finally, residents have a shorter lasting memory than migrants. Again, residents can easily update their knowledge in the environment. They just revisit the site, whereas migrants may only encounter a stopover site in the next 12 months when they're again on migration. So they need a long-lasting memory to remember high-quality stopover sites, or even remember their breeding site. All these studies use the cost-benefit approach, and it is really quite useful to generate hypotheses, but it also explains or also shows that animals use a kind of a cost-benefit approach to decide whether they should approach something, how quickly they should approach it, how much they explore it. I have covered the ecological conditions that have an effect. I covered the lifestyles, which have a huge effect. What is still missing is a social condition, where I'm convinced that they also have an effect, how animals collect information, whether they learn from their companions or whether they rely more on their own information. I have quite a few ideas about it, but I can't do it at the moment. So this is for the future. But I think it's an exciting area, which is little researched, but it's very, very important for the animals because it influences survival, reproduction, and fitness. Okay, yeah, this is the end of the talk. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thanks very much, Claudia. It's interesting. We do like the pictures. Any questions for Claudia?
Can I ask something about the cost and benefit approach.
Yes.
Is this a method that's been around in your area for a very long time, or is what it is just adopted recently?
I mean, it has been around the 50s. There was one researcher who came up with some anecdotal evidence between differences between species that had different foraging abilities. But then it was basically picked up by me in my PhD study, where I studied this experimentally in a big group of close related species, so we could control for phylogeny, but had different ecologies. So this was basically the starting point. I possibly should say, in biology, we often work with models, how animals decide, but all these models expect basically that the animal is fully informed. So they just jump over this information gathering part and assume the animal is fully informed, and then it can make decision to stay in this patch and forage or move to another patch, assuming that it exactly knows what is the value of these different patches. And only recently, so the last 10, 15 years, these modelists realized that animals obviously have to collect information, and this can be a very important part, and this is where this study fits in.
For example, have you compared behavior of those animals? You said about you have some results about residents and migrants. So have you compared that, for example, with the behavior of people?
Actually, I once had a proposal when I applied for a position in a human research center, where I wanted to compare basically personality traits between people that stay, let's say, their entire life in Liverpool and those that are more mobile. Do they have different personalities that makes them adaptable to a more migratory lifestyle, or being more resident? Yeah, you can connect this. Yeah, I think so.
Did you have to travel the world to 61 parrots?
I would love to.
Somebody provided it.
Yeah, it was in Germany one of the biggest bird parks, where it did most of the tests, and then a few other tests in other zoological collections. But I also went to Australia, where quite a few of the species are resident, and observed them and collected data just to see whether all the ecological information I have from the literature can be confirmed, or is there more to it. So I try to improve my data set about the ecology by own observation as good as possible. Yeah.
So would captivity have any influence on behavior? Or wilderness and captivity can be different around?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that captivity has some effect on behavior. And it may be when you breed with them that only the ones that can settle in best will reproduce, so you have some selection going on. But as these behaviors, exploration and neophobia, have a strong genetic basis, you still can find these differences in captive animals, even when you have bred them over several generations. But it's a very important point. In principle, you have to know, is your behavior genetically determined, or is it purely environmentally determined? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask about the genetic side. Last month we heard about the golden finch.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there was any obvious connection with genetics and the outcomes of your research.
In the golden finch, or?
With yours, if there's any kind of crossover.
Actually, the golden finch study is my PhD student, so there is some crossover. And we included exploration and neophobia in this, and then, as I mentioned before, personality traits, so that individuals have particular suits of behaviors that makes them a kind of more extrovert or introvert. You find the same in animals. And so, interestingly, exploration and neophobia are part of these personality traits. So how open an animal or human is towards novelty is a personality trait, and yeah, obviously is heritable and very consistent in a lifetime of an individual. So I continued basically my research in a single species with different head colors, So I had to stay with my comparative approach, I have to say. But I don't have enough space here to keep 2 or 3 or 4 different species. So I continue my comparative approach in a single species with different head colors, and look how different head colors may affect behavior, and they do. And again, it has a genetic basis, yeah.
Your study with Neophobia, where you put some food stuff down and something unfamiliar to the birds. Do birds make a judgment with regard to whether the food is more enticing to them, like for instance insects rather than seeds? Would that have an impact, or is food just food for birds?
No.
How do you know what it is?
No, every species is adapted to a different diet. Some are pure seed eaters, others are pure insect eaters, others are more omnivorous, so they eat a bit from everything. Yeah. So you have to adapt your experimental design to the species requirements. But even then, they have specific preferences. They may prefer wax worms over mealworms, for example, and you should know about these preferences. Not that they avoid something because they don't like it. Yes, you have to know quite a bit about your species. So,
for instance, if it's something that they have a greater preference for, will they be more inclined then to take the risk?
Yes, yeah. You can. There were quite a few studies where they looked for costs and benefits again. So having a huge food source, or a food source with lots of energy in, versus another food source with low energy, and then varying the risk. And then they investigate how much risk do they take to go to the good food source. Are the differences between dominant, subordinate individuals? So the subordinates usually take more risk to get a food source because they are chased away from the other ones. So yeah, this is one of these approaches where you use different quality to test your hypotheses.
Thank you very much. Well, I think judging by the number of different accents around the room, that if you ever do get funding for your human study, you might find quite a few migrants that would be willing to take part in your studies.
Yeah.
Real or partly.
Some natives as well.
Definitely, including myself.
Yes. Thanks very much for your talk.
Thank you.